The guilt architecture. How the conflation of natural law with legislative law has authorized suffering across civilization. 1. Architecture. A guilt architecture is a system organized around the management of transgression. It requires 4 elements: a law, a lawgiver who issued the law, a subject who is obligated to comply, and the implicit or explicit threat of punishment for deviation. These 4 elements, held together, constitute the primary structure by which the ego system organizes the relationship between the organism and reality, and by which the wounded civilization organizes the relationship between its institutions and its members. The guilt architecture is not a conspiracy, it is a consequence. When natural law, the grammar of nature, a living structure of what is, was translated into law in the legislative sense, it imported the grammar of legislation, the lawgiver, the subject, the obligation, the punishment. And that grammar, once installed at the cosmological level, replicated itself at every level below. Religious law, moral law, civil law, educational law, the unspoken law of family and community expectation. The architecture is fractal, as all genuine structures are, the same pattern at the scale of the cosmos and at the scale of the individual conscience. What the guilt architecture produces in the organism is a specific and well-documented condition, the helplessness of the subject before the authority that cannot be fully met, fully satisfied, fully appeased. The law is always already there, always already prior, always already in a position to judge. The subject is always already potentially in violation. This posture installs the body contracted, the attention organized around monitoring for deviation, the energy organized around compliance rather than genuine encounter, is the somatic signature of the wounded organism. It is the ego system's primary installation, and the guilt architecture is how it is transmitted from generation to generation, not through genetics, but through the structural condition of being raised within institutions organized around the management of transgression. 2. How it spreads. Science, religion, ethics, education. The guilt architecture entered each major domain of civilization through the same mechanism, the word law carrying its legislative grammar into a domain where it describes something structurally different. In religion, the divine is the lawgiver, the religious community is the subject, the law is the text of obligation, the commandments, Sharia, the Dharma as obligation, and transgression is sin. The violation that produces guilt requires atonement and threatens eternal punishment. The grammar of nature, the living, discoverable structure of the is ground of being, is replaced by a set of commandments issued by an authority. The creature's relationship to the creator becomes the subject's relationship to the legislator. Genuine encounter with the is ground is replaced by compliance with the law. Prayer becomes petition from the guilty to the authority. Worship becomes the subject's acknowledgement of the authority's supremacy. The mystical traditions within every religion, the ones that insisted on genuine encounter rather than compliance, were in every case regarded with suspicion by the institution, because genuine encounter with the is ground of being dissolves the authority structure that the institution requires. In science, The laws of nature appeared to be the great liberation from religious authority, empirical regularities that anyone could discover, independent of any divine legislator. But the legislative grammar of the word law remained, carrying its implication of an ordering authority behind the regularities. The result was a science that simultaneously proclaimed its freedom from supernatural lawgivers and organized itself around the authority of its own institutional law, the law of peer review, the law of replication, the law of statistical significance, the law of established consensus. Deviation from the established scientific law produces the same guilt architecture as the religious deviation. The transgressor is marginalized, their work dismissed, their status reduced. Sheldrake's observation that the so-called laws of nature might be habits, genuine mutable regularities rather than fixed decrees, was treated not as an interesting hypothesis but as a transgression of the law and responded to with the institution's full authority. Sheldrake is not a friend of conventional science, and conventional science has banished him. In ethics, the natural law tradition explicitly organized moral obligation around the legislative grammar. To know what is right is to know what the natural law requires. To do wrong is to transgress the law. The consequent guilt, not merely regret at harm caused, but the structural shame of having violated the authority's requirements, became the primary instrument of moral formation. Children are not taught to see the consequences of their actions on others and to respond to those consequences from genuine perception. Instead, they are taught to comply with the rules and feel guilty when they deviate. The result is not moral perception but moral compliance, which is, as this project has argued, not moral at all, but the ecosystem's management of authority's expectations. Stanley Milgram, demonstrated this conclusively. The authority of the law structure can override any other consideration, including the perception of harm being caused by a real person in the room. In education, the curriculum is organized as a set of laws to be learned and complied with. The correct answer is the one that matches the authority's standard. Deviation is wrong, not merely inaccurate, but wrong in the moral sense, carrying the guilt of having failed to comply. The grade is the guilt architecture's primary instrument. The judgment of the subject's compliance with the law, expressed as a number that follows the organism through its institutional life as the record of its transgressions and compliances. What is systematically excluded from this architecture is the genuine question, the one whose answer is not already known, the one that departs from the record of the known, because it is in genuine encounter with what it has not yet seen. The genuine question is, structurally, a departure from the curriculum's law. It is managed, redirected, or simply not heard. 3. The helplessness condition. The guilt architecture's deepest consequence is not guilt itself, but the helplessness that guilt produces. The organism, organized around compliance with an authority it cannot fully satisfy, is an organism that cannot act from its own genuine perception. It can only react from the known's management of the authority's expectations. This is the helplessness condition, not because the absence of capability, but the occupation of capability by the compliance management that leaves no room for genuine responsibility. Milgram's experiments showed this with terrible clarity. Ordinary people, organized within an authority structure, would administer what they believed were lethal electric shocks to innocent strangers, not because they wanted to cause harm, not because they lacked the perception that harm was being caused, but because the guilt architecture of the experimental situation had placed the authorities' law above their own genuine perception. The law said, continue. The perception said, stop. The guilt architecture won. And when it wins at the scale of a psychology experiment, it wins at the scale of war, at the scale of ecological destruction, at the scale of every institutional atrocity that well-meaning individuals have been part of while organizing their behavior around compliance with the law rather than genuine response to what is. The guilt architecture is the wound's most efficient transmission mechanism because it installs the helplessness condition before the organism is old enough to question it. The child raised within the authority structure of religious law, educational law, family law, social law, learns the posture of the threatened subject before learning the capacity for genuine encounter. The posture calcifies. By the time the organism is adult, the compliance management is so deeply installed that genuine responsibility, the capacity to respond to what is from the is ground, without the mediation of the authorities' law, feels dangerous rather than natural. The organism cannot distinguish between the genuine moral perception and the authorities' requirement, because both have been compressed into the single experience of what the law demands. 4. The dissolution. The dissolution of the guilt architecture is not accomplished by opposition. The ecosystem in opposition to the guilt architecture is still organized around the guilt architecture, still managing its relationship to the law, still defining itself by transgression, still leaving the mark of every encounter with the authority it is refusing. Opposition is the guilt architecture's most successful defense. It keeps the organism engaged with the authority structure even in resistance, and resistance leaves as much trace as compliance. The dissolution is accomplished by the disclosure of the grammar of nature. When the grammar is genuinely seen, when the organism discovers in genuine encounter with what is, that the structure of reality is not a law issued by an authority, but a living, discoverable grammar that expresses itself freely and inexhaustibly through every genuine encounter, the guilt architecture loses its foundation. Not through argument, not through opposition, through the direct perception that the lawgiver was never there. This is what the project means by the end of the spell. The spell is maintained by the absence of a direct encounter with the grammar. In the spell's grammar, reality is coercive. The organism is a subject, deviation is transgression, and the appropriate response to what is management rather than reception. When the grammar of nature is genuinely encountered, when the is ground's inexhaustibility is directly perceived, even briefly, even partially, the spell is locally ended. Not the guilt architecture refuted, but the assumption on which it rested, the assumption of the lawgiver, is revealed to have been empty. The circle is the primary technology for this dissolution, because the circle creates conditions in which the guilt architecture is deliberately suspended. The facilitator is not an authority issuing commands. The question is not an examination to be passed. The child's genuine uncertainty is not a violation of the curriculum's law, but the most valuable thing in the room. In these conditions, genuine presence, genuine agency, genuine belonging. The organism that has been organized around compliance with authority discovers, sometimes with surprise, that its native orientation is not compliance, but curiosity. The naturally curious organism was always already there, beneath the guilt architecture's installation. The circle does not create it. The circle creates the condition in which it can be seen and disclosed.